Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, the gravedigger of the Soviet Union. The Gulag Archipelago, Volume 1, by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was first published, at least parts of it were first published, in 1973, and Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was a dissident of the Soviet Union. There are 3 volumes that I am going to read, but in this video we're only going to be discussing Volume 1, because it's the only one I've read. And basically, the Gulag Archipelago tells the story of how Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was arrested at the end of World War II by the Soviet Union and thrown into the Gulag prison system of the Soviet Union. He was imprisoned in various different camps and prisons for 8 years, and then when he got out, he went into exile for, I believe, 3 years. And the term Gulag Archipelago is really in reference to the fact that these prisons and transit prisons and camps and all of that sort of stuff was kind of all over Russia. And Solzhenitsyn kind of likened that to being an archipelago of islands. So that's kind of just the way that he went about, he wanted the reader to picture this Gulag system as a vast archipelago, because it was, even if, it wasn't all on just a bunch of islands, although some of it was on some islands. The thing that's so significant about the Gulag Archipelago, and the reason why I read it, is, well, number one, I first heard about it from that very prominent psychologist, Jordan Peterson. I know he's somewhat controversial among certain circles. But nevertheless, he was correct about Time magazine calling this perhaps the best nonfiction book of the 20th century. And so whenever I saw him talking about this book, I was like, I should read that, because I don't know much about the Soviet Union. I don't know much about what went down there. And the reason this book is so significant is not because it's like the best history book regarding Russia, because it's not. I mean, what I will say is Solzhenitsyn jumps around at different points in history regarding Russia and the revolution and just the history of the Gulag system. And it's very hard to get things straight because he does that. He also doesn't explain what a lot of terms mean. Like, he has a glossary in the back of the book that explains, a lot of the terms he uses. But if I had consulted that the whole time, then I would have never finished the book, because it's a very, very thick book and takes a long time to read. Difficult to read in some ways, but nevertheless very good. But what I will say about the Gulag Archipelago is it presents a comprehensive portrait of evil. And it was a book that was revolutionary at the time, because people in the West had known about the evil of the Russian Gulag systems, but they had never known the extent of that evil. And Solzhenitsyn, with the Gulag Archipelago, it was the first attempt of anyone to compile a comprehensive history and expose of just how evil the Soviet Union was, concerning Stalin, Lenin, and just the overall Gulag prison system. Like, honestly, the big takeaway I get from reading the Gulag Archipelago Volume 1, and I can't speak as to the other volumes, but at least in Volume 1, I mean, I got to wrestle for like 600 pages with the fact that, as Solzhenitsyn says, the line dividing good and evil runs through the heart of every human being. I mean, there are some of the most shocking things I've ever read in this book. Like, I'm going to go into some of that whenever I get into the analysis of the different passages later on in this video. But man, I mean, this book is so hardcore. And, like I said, like, it's not a straightforward historical account. There is a lot of history in the book, but at the time that Solzhenitsyn was writing this, number one, he was writing it in secret, and he was primarily relying on the few public records that were available at the time, as well as 227 witnesses concerning the Gulag system. And so some of Solzhenitsyn's stats are inaccurate, and some of the stories that are presented in the Gulag Archipelago are not verifiable because of that. But that's only because the Russian archives were not open until, the 90s. And so, it is true, as some critics of Solzhenitsyn have pointed out, that, It's not the most reliable history book. But Solzhenitsyn, what's most amazing about the book are the things that he did get right. He got pretty much the whole overall outline of the Gulag system correct, as far as the practices, as far as its origin. It actually originated with Lenin, not Stalin, and Solovetsky Islands. And the book, and it also one of the things that's really interesting about the Gulag Archipelago is it introduced a whole new set of vocabulary, namely the slang terms of the Gulag systems. And that's part of the reason why it was so popular, because people were the millions of people that had been put through the sewage disposal system that was the Gulag Archipelago. They recognized the validity of Solzhenitsyn's words because he was using words that they had used when they were in prison. And so it's kind of an amazing book. I am intending to actually read the person who wrote the foreword to this wrote a book called Gulag, and that was Anne Applebaum. And I will probably read that book to get a more straightforward historical account. But nevertheless, I am going to read the next couple volumes of the Gulag Archipelago because, as Anne Applebaum points out in the foreword, this book is history. It is credited with being perhaps the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. What it did was tear the mask off of Soviet communism. Because before, people still had, back in the day, they had, the Beatles wrote, "Back in the USSR, how lucky you are." It's people had these insane ideas about the Soviet Union being a utopia. And Solzhenitsyn, just in one fell swoop, completely destroyed that narrative by providing, a mostly accurate history of what had been going on since the inception of the Soviet Union. This is a book where I'm just man, I want to be like that. I want to confidently tell the truth to the best of my ability, regardless of opposition, like Solzhenitsyn. In many ways, I see Solzhenitsyn as a role model in that way. He had to tell the truth. He had to get it out. And he did get it out. And thank God he did. I think it's a very important book to invest some time in. I will say there is an abridged version of the Gulag Archipelago that's only about 500 pages. I hear that that's really pretty good. Solzhenitsyn approved it himself. So if you don't want to spend 3 volumes in the world of Gulag, then I would recommend that you buy the abridged version of it. But since I've already read the first volume, I plan to read the following 2 volumes because I just kind of like the idea of reading this book in the way that it was originally published. This is an important book to read in whatever form you can get it, because this is not widely spread knowledge. It's not widely known, but it's very, very important knowledge to know. And now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's please jump into the review and analysis portion of the Gulag Archipelago Volume 1. So I divided this video up into different sections with different passages within each section so that I can organize my thoughts, more efficiently. And the first section has only one passage in it, and it is called "When Truth is Relative, So is Good and Evil." Now, in this first passage, there is a man that Solzhenitsyn makes reference to known as Andrei Yanivarovich Vyshinsky. I think I said it right. And this guy was a prosecutor during some of the show trials that took place in the early days of the Soviet Union. And these show trials were basically trials that convicted a lot of innocent people. They were show trials. They were a mockery of justice, but presented as being justice back in the day. We now know that they were just full of shit. Back in the day, it was, the commies are rooting out insurgents, when in reality they were just, destroying innocent people's lives most of the time. But anyways, this prosecutor, Andrei Yanivarovich Vyshinsky, he did some very interesting things. And Solzhenitsyn does a great job of explaining Vyshinsky's impact and how it led to, many of the horrors of the Soviet Union. It turns out that in that terrible year, Andrei Yanivarovich one longs to blurt out Yagavarich, Wyszynski, availing himself of the most flexible dialects, of a sort nowadays not permitted either Soviet citizens or electronic calculators, since to them yes is yes and no is no, pointed out in a report which became famous in certain circles that it is never possible for mortal men to establish absolute truth, but relative truth only. He then proceeded to a further step, which jurists of the last 2,000 years had not been willing to take, that the truth established by interrogation and trial could not be absolute, but only, so to speak, relative. Therefore, when we sign a sentence ordering someone to be shot, we can never be absolutely certain, but only approximately, in view of certain hypotheses, and in a certain sense, that we are punishing a guilty person. Thence arose the most practical conclusion, that it was useless to seek absolute evidence, for evidence is always relative, or unchallengeable witnesses, for they can say different things at different times. The proofs of guilt were relative, approximate, and the interrogator could find them, even when there was no evidence and no witness, without leaving his office, basing his conclusions not only on his own intellect, but also on his party sensitivity, his moral forces. In other words, the superiority of someone who has slept well, has been well fed, and has not been beaten up, and on his character, i.e. his willingness to apply cruelty. Of course, this formulation was much more elegant than Lassis's instructions, but the essence of both was the same. In only one respect did Wyszynski fail to be consistent and retreat from dialectical logic. For some reason, the executioner's bullet, which he allowed, was not relative, but absolute. Thus it was that the conclusions of advanced Soviet jurisprudence, proceeding in a spiral, returned to barbaric or medieval standards. Like medieval torturers, art interrogators, prosecutors, and judges agreed to accept the confession of the accused as the chief proof of guilt. This process of making the truth relative in the Soviet Union, I think, is a large reason for why the Soviet Union was as evil as it was. Because, as I said in the title of this section, when truth is relative, so is good and evil. If you can't say whether or not something is objectively true, then you can't say whether or not something is objectively good or objectively evil. Now, good and evil is a very complicated subject, but it absolutely has to be dependent on something. And if that something isn't truth, then, it's impossible to know up from down, right from wrong, guilty versus not guilty. When the truth becomes relative, it's just, it's all just a matter of might is right. And in the Soviet Union, Lenin, Stalin, they were mighty, and so therefore they were right. Therefore, you were guilty, even if you didn't do anything wrong. And he said, Solzhenitsyn points out something here, that part of this Wyszynski ideology regarding truth, regarding guilt versus not guilt, was based on conclusions not only on his own intellect, but also on his party sensitivity, his moral forces, and on his character. There is this idea that was present that, and Solzhenitsyn eviscerates throughout the book, of this, your infallible intuition, your revolutionary conscience, Solzhenitsyn describes it as. The belief, and this has taken place, I think, in large part in America, it's this belief that because I feel that you're guilty, therefore you are. And the reason I know you're guilty is because my intuition is infallible. I mean, that's kind of the logic that takes place with, you look at a lot of our political systems where you see, this person's a white supremacist. Do we have any evidence? No, but I just know that he is because I know them when I see them because of my revolutionary conscience. You see this all the time in politics. This person is a bigot. That person's a blah, blah, blah. Solely based on nothing but personal intuition. And it's very dangerous, this revolutionary conscience, this your truth, my truth, this relativization of the truth is dangerous. And it was dangerous in the Soviet Union, and it had its obvious, long list of evils and consequences that came of it. And it is dangerous now, and I fear that in our day and age, we may have a lot of consequences for our process that we have all seemed to have undertaken of compromising and relativizing the truth. All right, now, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to Section 2 of this review and analysis, and Section 2 is called The Evil of Power, Politics, and Ideology. Power is a poison well known for thousands of years. If only no one were ever to acquire material power over others. But to the human being who has faith in some force that holds dominion over all of us, and who is therefore conscious of his own limitations, power is not necessarily fatal. For those, however, who are unaware of any higher sphere, it is a deadly poison. For them, there is no antidote. There's a lot in this passage to talk about, even though it's so short. When Solzhenitsyn says, "But to the human being who has faith in some force that holds dominion over all of us, and who is therefore conscious of his own limitations, power is not necessarily fatal," I think he is absolutely correct. Now, it is true that, religion has done some great evil in the world. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say religion. I would say religious adherents who are more fanatical about it. But there is something to say about religion and about the belief in God. It provides a check. Like when you think that God is watching you in your actions, it provides a check on your ego and your conscience. That's why in the book of Proverbs in the Bible it says, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. The idea being that if you have humility before God, if you accept that you actually are not God, that you are not all-knowing, then you can actually become wise, because you're actually open to learning. And so, there are things, like I think Solzhenitsyn is correct, like there are things that I have not done specifically because I believe that God is watching me. There's a check on my conscience. There's a check on my behavior. And that is absent, as Solzhenitsyn points out, in people who do not believe in any higher sphere or are unaware of any higher sphere. To those people, as far as they're concerned, there's nothing to hold them back except for personal preference. Stalin did not believe in God. There was nothing to hold him back. There was no higher moral authority to say, "Hey, Stalin, you shouldn't starve millions of your own people." There was nothing. There was no transcendent moral authority that was binding to him. He was not worried about, an authority in the sky looking down on him. He was only worried about what he thought and about, who he wanted to kill next. There was no check on his conscience. And that's why I think, when you look at the 20th century, I think power, if there's nothing to check it, if there's nothing to hold it back, if there's no power or no belief in a power to keep earthly power in check, then earthly power just goes nuts on people. People can't they can't handle it. There's that old saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I haven't read the great Russian novelist Dostoevsky, but I will say this. I have heard the famous quote, "Without God, all things are permissible." Yeah, I think that Solzhenitsyn would agree with that. Now, this next passage I think has a lot of relevance to today, considering that America has become absolutely obsessed with political fanaticism. And Solzhenitsyn is not really a fan of politics. He doesn't really think of it as a very high, a high profession. He kind of thinks that it's pretty ridiculous. I'll just read what he says here, and we'll discuss. "After all, politics is not even a science, but is an empirical area not susceptible to description by any mathematical apparatus. Furthermore, it is an area subject to human egotism and blind passion." This is exactly correct. And this passage, in many ways, builds off of the last passage concerning power. I think that the reason people have become so obsessed with politics in America and in many places is because they've forgotten that that higher sphere, that check on power, and power in our society has been exercised by some people who were not worthy of exercising that power. And so we're all focused on power, and instead of going to the ancient texts that have always guided us. We instead look to politics for the answers to the hole that religion once filled in our hearts, you might say. But of course, as Solzhenitsyn says, it is an area subject to human egotism and blind passion. And so while politics is obviously necessary, you have to have, if you have a government, you're going to have politics. I think the political fanaticism that has taken place in particularly America is promulgated on or rests upon human egotism and blind passion, because we're all looking for something to make sense of the powerful actions of powerful people who, think that they're God. Now, this next passage also kind of piggybacks off of the previous two passages, because of course it's a part of the same section. Duh. But this passage, I would like to discuss it more in the context of what people call the Great Reset. This kind of theory that, there are a whole bunch of rich people that are conspiring to, completely restructure the world economy. I haven't looked into much of this Great Reset stuff. I know a lot of people have talked about it. But I do know that the World Economic Forum did put out a video, I believe it was in 2016 or maybe it was 2020, I don't know. But where they made a prediction that in 2030, you'll own nothing and be happy. And this passage from Solzhenitsyn, I think it tells the real story behind the whole you'll own nothing and be happy. In our country, the right to own private property was at one time just as effectively banished out in freedom too, and then those who banished it began to enjoy possessing things. The people that want us to own nothing want to own everything. Marxists do this all the time. And, for a perfect example, there was that Black Lives Matter founder who has said on record, we are trained Marxists, about her other founders within the Black Lives Matter movement. She recently bought it was like a $1.4 million house. It's very fascinating how Marxists, who are always like, we want to abolish private property, they always end up, enriching themselves with large amounts of private property that's very expensive. Because of course they benefited from capitalism. I just thought that was funny to bring up, because it is true. Within the Soviet Union, as Solzhenitsyn said, the people who wanted us to abolish private property took so much pleasure in owning all private property. They take everything from you so that they can have everything. Perhaps, I don't want to read too much into the intentions of the World Economic Forum and some of these Great Reset people. Also, I don't know how much of the allegations against them are true. But whenever they say, in 2030, you'll own nothing and be happy, I've got to say, I do suspect that they'll probably own all of that stuff that we don't own anymore. And I don't know if we'll be all that happy about it. I could be wrong, but we'll see. We'll see. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this next passage may be the most important passage I go over in this entire video. The passage has to deal with something that has taken over the conscience of many Americans and just many people in many other countries worldwide. It's a virus of the mind, I would describe it. It's something that allows people to justify their actions no matter how heinous they are. What Solzhenitsyn says about this certain something, I think is absolutely true. And I think we should all, in unison, be against this certain something. Because this certain something will probably kill us all. Do you want to know what this certain something is, people? Okay, well, allow Solzhenitsyn, through my voice, to tell you. That was the strangest setup to a passage ever. I hope you enjoyed it, though. Anyways, let's read about that certain something. Something. Ideology. That is what gives evildoing its long-sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad in his own and others' eyes, so that he won't hear reproaches and curses, but will receive praise and honors. That was how the agents of the Inquisition fortified their wills, by invoking Christianity, the conquerors of foreign lands by extolling the grandeur of their motherland, the colonizers by civilization, the Nazis by race, and the Jacobins, early and late, by equality, brotherhood, and the happiness of future generations. Thanks to ideology, the 20th century was fated to experience evil-doing on a scale calculated in the millions. This cannot be denied, nor passed over, nor suppressed. How, then, do we dare insist that evildoers do not exist? And who was it that destroyed these millions? Without evildoers, there would have been no archipelago. I think every single thing that Solzhenitsyn said in that is absolutely correct. I think ideology is the thing that brings about genocide. I mean, he made reference to Christianity in there, and as I understand it, Solzhenitsyn became a Christian. But it is true that Christianity, there are some sects of Christianity that have a very strict ideology that's somewhat based on Christianity, but not really, that allows them to justify using Christianity to do horrible, evil, heinous things. And so whenever people say, oh, Christianity did this to all these other people, it was really more ideology, the ideologies that people build around Christianity. And same thing for Islam. Now, I haven't read the Quran, so I can't really speak too, authoritatively on it. But as I understand it, most Muslims are totally against this, crusading violence and terrorism and all that sort of thing. But ideology, there is an ideology amongst, the more fanatic Muslims that seeks to use Islam as an excuse to murder and pillage and conquer the world if they can. And I see ideology in many ways taking place in America with our political systems. And I think it's really, really dangerous, and I think we all need to abandon this ideology stuff, this us versus them mentality, this I'm right because I'm right mentality. I mean, look, on the right, in 2020, there was a portion of the right, by no means everybody, but certainly there was a portion of the right that seemed to be under the impression that Donald Trump was some sort of supernatural warrior sent by God to save America. It wasn't a huge portion, but I did see the memes of people, putting Trump with a halo around his head, people talking about him as if he was the savior of the United States. And I see, the people that, kind of promulgated this very bizarre cultic affection for Trump as they were trying to replace what religion was once held in their lives. They were looking for like a savior, a new messiah, so to speak. And I think it's very dangerous. We saw the result of that with the January 6th Capitol riot. And it wasn't good. It was very ugly. And I think a lot of this was motivated by ideology. Again, like a lot of those people that rioted at the Capitol, a lot of them probably came from some sort of Christian background, but they clearly didn't really know a whole lot about Christianity, or only read about the parts of Christianity that confirmed their preconceived ideology of what the world is. Because they clearly didn't read about, all the evil of pride, greed, and a loose tongue, things that, Trump was certainly guilty of. They probably more, didn't read most of the book, or just constructed a whole ideology that somehow, made what they were doing okay. But of course it wasn't okay. Likewise, on the political left in America, there is this hashtag woke stuff, where they simultaneously, these people, preach love and tolerance, and then turn around and try to ruin you if you disagree with them on any LGBTQ plus, initiative. It's like, in the name of diversity, conform. This is what these people are like. I mean, and I see this as an attempt to graft a new dogma onto society, a dogma that is just purely an ideology. I mean, that's really what dogma is in a lot of ways. Like, people, they often make reference to dogma when they talk about religion. And there obviously is dogma in religion, but there are all these stories that contextualize its meaning and, how it should be enforced. But when you don't have all these stories, as the woke people have, then you just have pure dogma, pure ideology, and it ends up with everybody trying to cancel one another. And we're going to talk about cancel culture, but here in a minute, because it's due to ideology. And I just want people to quit this obsession of I'm right and you're wrong, and if you disagree, then oh shit, you better run, you motherfucker. Now, people need to stop this. They need to stop this, like, immediately. Because ideology will be our end, as it has been the end of millions upon millions of people. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's read about some of the consequences, the real consequences of ideology, the real evil of ideology, in our next section, which is called We Are Still Barbarians. This first passage is pretty hardcore, so emotionally prepare yourself for hell. If the intellectuals in the plays of Chekhov, who spent all their time guessing what would happen in 20, 30, or 40 years, had been told that in 40 years, interrogation by torture would be practiced in Russia, that prisoners would have their skulls squeezed within iron rings, that a human being would be lowered into an acid bath, that they would be trussed up naked to be bitten by ants and bedbugs, that a ramrod heated over a Primus stove would be thrust up their anal canal, the secret brand, that a man's genitals would be slowly crushed beneath the toe of a jackboot, and that, in the luckiest possible circumstances, prisoners would be tortured by being kept from sleeping for a week, by thirst, and by being beaten to a bloody pulp, not one of Chekhov's plays would have gotten to its end, because all the heroes would have gone off to insane asylums. Hitler and Stalin are not ancient history, guys. They haven't even been dead for 100 years. Humanity is still capable of absolute barbarism. Also capable of great things. But we must never forget that we are the same people as they were then, and capable of the same things, good and bad. Now, in this next passage, Solzhenitsyn makes reference to what he calls the organs, which is basically a slang term for the Soviet, secret police agencies. And in this passage, he details just kind of their overall attitude regarding arrests. There were pandemics or epidemics of arrests in Soviet Russia. Arrests of many, 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 many people that were just totally innocent. But again, when truth becomes relative and you rely on your revolutionary conscience, then if a person looks guilty to you, then they are. Or if a person maybe doesn't look guilty, but you need them to be guilty for a certain purpose, then they are guilty. By and large, the organs had no profound reasons for their choice of whom to arrest and whom not to arrest. They merely had overall assignments, quotas, for a specific number of arrests. These quotas might be filled on an orderly basis or wholly arbitrarily. In 1937, a woman came to the reception room of the Novotcherkassk NKVD to ask what she should do about the unfed, unweaned infant of a neighbor who had been arrested. They said, "Sit down, we'll find out." She sat there for 2 hours, whereupon they took her and tossed her into a cell. They had a total plan, which had to be fulfilled in a hurry, and there was no one available to send out into the city, and here was this woman already in their hands. They just needed somebody to arrest, and so they arrested this innocent woman who was trying to look after the infant of someone who had also been arrested. Again, I see this as a consequence of the relativizing of truth and unchecked power. Now, this next passage is quite long, and it takes place a little bit later in the book, but it's a very important passage to read to get you to understand the terror of what it was like to be sent to one of these camps. So Solzhenitsyn was, at this time in the book, being held in a transit prison, which was also horrific. But he encountered, in this transit prison, a special assignment prisoner, a guy who had been a kind of a veteran prisoner for a long time, several different camps. And he and Solzhenitsyn and his fellow cellmates asked him, hey, what should we expect when we are finally sent off to one of these camps? And what this man says is quite horrifying, and I think it is worth considering the next time you think that you've got it bad in life. Reading from the top. What should we expect in camp? Taking pity on us, he taught us, from your very first step in camp, everyone will try to deceive and plunder you. Trust no one but yourself. Look around quickly. Someone may be sneaking up on you to bite you. 8 years ago, I arrived at Karpalag, just as innocent and just as naive as you are now. They unloaded us from 2 trains, and the convoy prepared to lead us the 6 miles to the camp through the deep, crumbly snow. 3 sleds came up beside us. Some hefty chap whom the convoy didn't interfere with came over to us and said, "Brothers, put your things on the sleds, and we will carry them there for you." We remembered reading in books that prisoners' belongings were carried on carts, and we thought, it isn't going to be all that inhumane in camp. They are concerned about us. And we loaded our things on the sleds. They left, and we never saw them again, not even an empty wrapper. But how can that happen? Isn't there any law there? Don't ask idiotic questions. There is a law there, the law of the taiga, of the jungle. But as for justice, there never has been any in Gulag, and there never will be. The Kargil incident was simply a symbol of Gulag. And you have to get used to something else too. In camp, no one ever does anything for nothing. No one ever does anything out of the generosity of his heart. You have to pay for everything. If someone proposes something to you that is unselfish, disinterested, you can be sure that it's a dirty trick, a provocation. The main thing is, avoid general assignment work. Avoid it from the day you arrive. If you land in general assignment work that first day, then you are lost, and this time for keeps. General assignment work? General assignment work. That is the main and basic work performed in any given camp. 80% of the prisoners work at it, and they all die off. All. And then they bring new ones in to take their places, and they again are sent to general assignment work. Doing this work, you expend the last of your strength, and you are always hungry, and always wet, and shoeless, and you are given short rations and short everything else, and put in the worst barracks. And they won't give you any treatment when you're ill. The only ones who survive in camps are those who try at any price not to be put on general assignment work from the first day. At any price? At any price. At Kresna Presnya, this is Solzhenitsyn speaking, I assimilated and accepted this altogether unexaggerated advice of the cruel special assignment prisoner, forgetting only to ask him one thing. How do you measure that price? How high do you go? I don't really have much to say about this passage other than, holy crap, that's terrifying. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the final passage. It's really just one line of the "We Are Still Barbarians" section of this review. And this line, I think you'll understand without me even really having to explain what it means. Human nature, if it changes at all, changes not much faster than the geological face of the Earth. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think I've made a pretty strong case for that being the case throughout this entire review. We are still barbarians. We haven't changed, not one bit. We are still capable, as I said earlier, of great good and of the worst evil. And much and most of this is thanks to ideology, as is cancel culture, which we shall now talk about now. The next section of this video is called Where Cancel Culture Has Gone and Will Go. But I do need to preface this section with a little bit of information. Namely that cancel culture is real. I do not understand these people who seem to be under the impression that it's not real. Cancel culture is basically the forcing of your beliefs on other people, even going so far as to take away their job, take away their voice. That is what cancel culture is in the American context. Now, where it goes is where it went in the Soviet Union, which I will explain in a minute. But, the list of people that have been canceled is very long now. I mean, this ideology, this honestly, I do have to point fingers, this woke ideology is the primary culprit of this evil, I would say. You know, Kevin Hart makes a joke about gay people 10 years ago. How dare he commit the crime of being a comedian? You know, and these people, they forced him to step down from the Oscars. He apologized. They wouldn't forgive him. He kept on apologizing until they went away. I mean, this culture it's everywhere. Gina Carano, if you actually read what she wrote on Instagram concerning, political tribalism, she was absolutely correct. And yet she was fired from Disney for her political beliefs, even though she didn't even state any of them. So weird. Everybody said that she was, trying to draw an equivalency between conservatives and, Jews being persecuted and in Nazi Germany. But she didn't even say conservative or liberal. She just said, hey, if you create a society that just hates certain groups of people, you could end up committing genocide like the Germans did. And she was correct. And yet she was the one who was canceled. And honestly, the people that canceled her kind of proved her point. They hated her. They treated her like crap. They demonized her, dehumanized her. And this cancel culture, I don't want to spend too much more time talking about the American version of it. But you need to acknowledge that it exists. I mean, Twitter has a misgendering policy that is ideologically motivated. Namely, a band of conservatives did not come up with it, even if you agree with it. A bunch of Oklahomans didn't come up with that, probably. And they have used that to ban people that say things like, a man can never be a woman. Example of this is Megan Murphy. I mean, the list goes on and on of those who have been canceled, and it's a very, very ugly thing. It's a very, very dangerous thing. And I would like to illustrate just how dangerous it can get. And in order to understand this passage, you have to understand that Solzhenitsyn is talking about the show trial of the famine organizers. The Soviet Union kind of went to great lengths in the 20s and 30s to, blame all of their mistakes on innocent people. And so they found these people that they call the wreckers, people in the food industry, that they determined organized the famine, when in reality it was really caused by the Communist Party. So just know that going in, that this is what Solzhenitsyn is talking about whenever he makes reference to the way the people were made to cheer for these false convictions, these cancelings of individuals who actually didn't do anything wrong. Also, I need to point out that whenever Solzhenitsyn speaks about sewage disposal, he's not actually talking about sewage disposal. He's using this as a term. It's kind of like a metaphor for how the Soviet, Gulag system would just, wash society of, of its goodness, and just, it was like a sewage pipe. It was just like a sewage disposal system. That's what the Gulag was like. It would just take people out and send them off to nowhere. And so that's what he means whenever he makes reference to sewage disposal in this passage. It was precisely at this moment that an important step was taken toward universal participation in sewage disposal, universal distribution of responsibility for it. Those who had not yet been swept bodily down the sewer hatches, who had not yet been carried through the pipes to the archipelago, had to march up above, carrying banners praising the trials and rejoicing at the judicial reprisals. And this was very far-sighted. Decades would pass and history would have its eyes opened, but the interrogators, judges, and prosecutors would turn out to be no more guilty than you and I, fellow citizens. The reason we possess our worthy gray heads is that in our time we worthily voted for. Cancel culture began during this time with complicity. People, they went along with what the government said. Oh, of course these people are the bad people. We will cheer for them to be thrown down the sewer hatches. We will be happy to see them canceled. And this sort of thing happens. Even and these people did this, when they knew that it wasn't quite as straightforward as the party was making out to be. They knew something was up, and yet they did it anyways. They carried banners and was like, oh yes, justice is done, yada, yada, yada. They were cheerleaders for other people getting canceled. This is something that happens in the U.S. all the time, and it's very interesting. You see these, these people who cheer whenever, for instance, Donald Trump was banned. They're like, oh, yay, great, this is amazing. But as always happens in some of these people, they themselves got banned. And went, what? How? The cancel culture comes to you. It always does. This is the way this sort of stuff works. And it's ugly all the way around. And in the Soviet Union, it was particularly ugly because there were physical physical consequences. Like the cancellations back in the Soviet Union were real physical ones. In our day and age, they're primarily virtual. For now. Then came the time, slowly it is true, but surely, when it was the turn of the members of the ruling party to do time in prison. At first, from 1927 to 1929, it was a question of the workers' opposition, in other words, the Trotskyites, who had chosen themselves such an unsuccessful leader. They numbered hundreds at the start. Soon there would be thousands. But it's the first step that's the hardest. Just as these Trotskyites had observed with approval the arrest of members of other parties, so the rest of the party now watched approvingly as the Trotskyites were arrested. But everyone would have his turn. The non-existent righteous opposition would come later, and limb by limb, beginning with its own tail, the ravenous maw would devour itself, right up to its head. If you cancel Abraham Lincoln, tear down his statue, guess whose statue's gonna be torn down? Yours, by future generations who will not have sympathy for you. If you applaud, somebody who's politically opposite of you being banned on social media, guess what's going to happen to you whenever some of your views go outside the mainstream? You're going to get canceled, and you're going to be like, oh shit, I see why that was a problem for me to cheerlead about, other people being canceled. This is not okay. You gotta take a stand on principle with regards to this stuff, because the ravenous maw will devour itself right up to its head every single time, and you do not want to be that head. Now this next passage is, it's just kind of a curious parallel between the past and the present. I'm just gonna read it and we'll discuss. The revolution had hastened to rename everything so that everything would seem new. Thus, the death penalty was rechristened the supreme measure, no longer a punishment, but a means of social defense. Now, as far as I know, nobody is calling for the death penalty to be renamed the supreme measure and as a tool of social defense, but it is true that our society is obsessed with renaming things so that everything seems new. We do away with the past so that way we can have a pure present. Of course, this is lunacy, but nevertheless, it is reality these days. It's interesting to read a Soviet dissident describe the slow process of dehumanization. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn in Volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago, he has this 2-page passage. I'm going to read the whole thing. It's actually more like 3 pages. Where he talks about how a certain class of people, known as the kulaks, were, through a slow process of dehumanization and propaganda, or by means of propaganda, were made to be seen by society and by the government as a nuisance to be got rid of. I find this passage to be so incredibly relevant to today concerning the way certain political factions in this country characterize other political factions and the people that exist in them. I will explain further what I mean by this after I read the passage, so without further ado, let's read the passage. And so the waves foamed and rolled, but over them all, in 1929 and 1930, billowed and gushed the multi-million wave of dispossessed kulaks. It was immeasurably large, and it could certainly not have been housed in even the highly developed network of Soviet interrogation prisons, which in any case were packed full by the gold wave. Instead, it bypassed the prisons, going directly to the transit prisons and camps, onto prisoner transports into the Gulag country. In sheer size, this non-recurring tidal wave, it was an ocean, swelled beyond the bounds of anything the penal system of even an immense state can permit itself. There was nothing to be compared with it in all Russian history. It was the forced resettlement of a whole people, an ethnic catastrophe. But yet, so cleverly were the channels of the GPU Gulag organized that the cities would have noticed nothing had they not been stricken by a strange 3-year famine, a famine that came about without drought and without war. This wave was also distinct from all those which preceded it because no one fussed about with taking the head of the family first and then working out what to do with the rest of the family. On the contrary, in this wave, they burned out whole nests, whole families from the start, and they watched jealously to be sure that none of the children, 14, 10, even 6 years old, got away. To the last scrapings, all had to go down the same road, to the same common destruction. This was the first such experiment, at least in modern history. It was subsequently repeated by Hitler with the Jews, and again by Stalin with nationalities which were disloyal to him or suspected by him. This wave included only pathetically few of those kulaks for whom it was named, in order to draw the wool over people's eyes. In Russian, a kulak is a miserly, dishonest, rural trader who grows rich not by his own labor, but through someone else's, through usury and operating as a middleman. In every locality, even before the revolution, such kulaks could be numbered on one's fingers. And the revolution totally destroyed their basis of activity. Subsequently, after 1917, by a transfer of meaning, the name kulak began to be applied in official and propaganda literature, whence it moved into general usage, to all those who in any way hired workers, even if it was only when they were temporarily short of working hands in their own families. But we must keep in mind that after the revolution, it was impossible to pay less than a fair wage for all such labor. The committees of the poor and the village Soviets looked after the interests of landless laborers. Just let somebody try to swindle a landless laborer. To this very day, in fact, the hiring of labor at a fair wage is permitted in the Soviet Union. But the inflation of this scathing term, kulak, proceeded relentlessly, and by 1930 all strong peasants in general were being so called. All peasants strong in management, strong in work, or even strong merely in convictions. The term kulak was used to smash the strength of the peasantry. Let us remember, let us open our eyes. Only a dozen years had passed since the great decree on the land. That very decree, without which the peasants would have refused to follow the Bolsheviks, and without which the October Revolution would have failed. The land was allocated in accordance with the number of mouths per family, equally. It had been only 9 years since the men of the peasantry had returned from the Red Army and rushed onto the land they had wrested for themselves. Then suddenly there were kulaks and there were poor peasants. How could that be? Sometimes it was the result of differences in initial stock and equipment. Sometimes it may have resulted from luck in the mixture of the family. But wasn't it most often a matter of hard work and persistence? And now these peasants, whose bread grain had fed Russia in 1928, were hastily uprooted by local good-for-nothings and city people sent in from outside. Like raging beasts, abandoning every concept of humanity, abandoning all humane principles which had evolved through the millennia, they began to round up the very best farmers and their families, and to drive them, stripped of their possessions, naked, into the northern wastes, into the tundra and the taiga. Such a mass movement could not help but develop subsequent ramifications. It became necessary to rid the villages also of those peasants who had merely manifested an aversion to joining the collective farms, or an absence of inclination for the collective life, which they had never seen with their own eyes, about which they knew nothing, and which they suspected, we now know how well-founded their suspicions were, would mean a life of forced labor and famine under the leadership of loafers. Then it was also necessary to get rid of those peasants, some of them not at all prosperous, who, because of their daring, their physical strength, their determination, their outspokenness in meetings, and their love of justice, were favorites with their fellow villagers and by virtue of their independence were therefore dangerous to the leadership of the collective farm. Beyond this, in every village, there were people who in one way or another had personally gotten in the way of the local activists. This was the perfect time to settle accounts with them of jealousy, envy, insult. A new word was needed for all these victims as a class, and it was born. By this time, it had no social or economic content whatsoever, but it had a marvelous sound. Podkulachnik, a person aiding the kulaks. In other words, I consider you an accomplice of the enemy, and that finishes you. The most tattered landless laborer in the countryside could quite easily be labeled a podkulachnik. And so it was that these two terms embraced everything that constituted the essence of the village, its energy, its keenness of wit, its love of hard work, its resistance, and its conscience. They were torn up by the roots, and collectivization was accomplished. So the reason I read that passage, and the reason I think it is so relevant to today's, political fanaticism, is if you notice, the term kulak changed meaning to encompass way more people than the actual definition of the term would ordinarily, encompass. Initially it meant, just kind of like a greedy person who profits off of the labor of other people. And Solzhenitsyn talked about how there was not really that many people that even did that back then. There was a very small handful. But the Soviets, they needed an excuse for arrest, and they needed to kind of destroy the whole kulak culture, the whole political class of, independent farmers and people who just wanted to live their own life apart from the collectivized state. And so they expanded the term kulak. And it began to take on, just regular people who they just weren't the biggest fan of this communist idea of the way to run a farm. And this term kulak got so big and it encompassed so many people that its initial meaning didn't mean any, no longer applied. And then what was so fascinating in this passage is it talked about how then that wasn't even enough. No, they needed to come up with a term, they said podkulanik. I can't really pronounce that very well, but the Soviets had to come up with a new term, and so that they could arrest more people who were associated with the kulaks. And this was all, of course, in an effort to, dismantle the whole bourgeoisie, structure in Russia. And it ended with a famine, as Solzhenitsyn said, that was not caused by drought or war. It was just an evil, evil famine. And it's fascinating, where you read later in the book how, the Soviets then put people on trial and blamed them for the famine, when in reality it was the Soviets that caused the famine in the first place. I think that this, expansion of the meaning of terms, this changing of definitions is something that's taking place right now in America. Bear with me here, but the term white supremacist is, I think, very similar to the term kulak, in that, truth be told, there's a very, very, very small amount of actual true white supremacist. I've never met a KKK member in my life. Of the people that I've met who have said racist things, it's a very small handful, and none of them would identify as white supremacists. And this is my entire life, and I live in Oklahoma, the reddest state in the country, okay? And yet, all day long, we hear on CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, talking about how, basically white supremacy is behind every corner. And how white supremacists are, up to something. Of course they are up to something, but the number is, like I said, so small. And yet our media talks about white supremacists all the time. And my theory, and I think this is a fair thing to say, my theory is that the term white supremacist has been hijacked by a bunch of propaganda artists who they want to, instead of meeting the arguments of, say, people on the political right who are more conservative, they just want to label them as white supremacists. They expand the term of white supremacist to mean anyone who is remotely conservative. Again, I think this is a fair observation. It seems to me like the left is very content to flippantly call, people who voted for Trump white supremacists or Nazis. I'm sorry, the data's not there to support that half of the country are a bunch of white supremacists and Nazis. It's a good way to, chill the speech of conservatives, because they're afraid that they might be called a white supremacist. Now, am I saying that this is going to end in a genocide of people that are Republicans or are conservatives or, right-wing libertarians? No, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that that same propagandistic tactic used by the leftist Soviets is being used by the leftist Americans, of taking a term that describes a very, very small group of people and using that term in a very disingenuous and dishonest way to malign a whole bunch of people that are completely innocent of white supremacy. I think it is incumbent upon all of us to commit to stop this bullshit. So if you're on the left and, you disagree with conservatives, maybe you even just hate them, don't stoop to the level of calling people white supremacist Nazis unless they actually are that, unless you actually have evidence of that. And similarly, if you're on the right, don't stoop so low as to call everyone on the left a communist. It's not okay to malign entire groups of people based on very, very small minorities of actually bad people. So let's stop this nonsense, people. Let's cancel culture. Which leads us to the next section of this video, which is called How to Cancel Culture. Solzhenitsyn has the answers, so let's read what he has to say. So what is the answer? How can you stand your ground when you are weak and sensitive to pain, when people you love are still alive, when you are unprepared? What do you need to make you stronger than the interrogator and the whole trap? From the moment you go to prison, you must put your cozy past firmly behind you. At the very threshold, you must say to yourself, my life is over, a little early to be sure, but there's nothing to be done about it. I shall never return to freedom. I am condemned to die, now or a little later, but later on, in truth, it will be even harder, and so the sooner the better. I no longer have any property whatsoever. For me, those I love have died, and for them I have died. From today on, my body is useless and alien to me. Only my spirit and my conscience remain precious and important to me. Confronted by such a prisoner, the interrogation will tremble. Now, obviously, Solzhenitsyn there is talking about, what it's like to undergo the interrogation and to be, fully canceled, like sent to prison. Perhaps it's a slightly hyperbolic comparison for me to read that passage in relation to cancel culture today, although, again, cancel culture will end up there if we allow it to. But the thing I want you to take from that passage is that the best way to win in the interrogation there, he says, confronted by such a prisoner, the interrogation will tremble. The best way to cancel culture is to boldly say no. I will not allow this. I will not allow you to do this. I will not apologize because I have done nothing wrong. The people that are so for all this cancel culture, they are bullies, and they need to be stood up to. And if we all stand up to them, they will have nowhere to go. They will back down. And having this resolve to simply, be committed to the truth and to your dignity and your self-respect, that is the way. Having that attitude is the way to make the cancelers tremble and the interrogation tremble and the whole, society of bullshit run away from you. This next passage I would like to read has to do with a story of boldly standing up against people that try to do harm to you. And this is an amazing story. I'm just going to read it and we'll discuss. In Stolyarova recalls an old woman who was her neighbor on the Butriki bunks in 1937. They kept on interrogating her every night. 2 years earlier, a former metropolitan of the Orthodox Church who had escaped from exile had spent a night at her home on his way through Moscow. But he wasn't the former metropolitan. He was the metropolitan. Truly, I was worthy of receiving him. All right, then. To whom did he go when he left Moscow? I know, but I won't tell you. The metropolitan had escaped to Finland via an underground railroad of believers. At first, the interrogators took turns, and they went after her in groups. They shook their fists in the little old woman's face, and she replied, "There is nothing you can do with me, even if you cut me into pieces. After all, you are afraid of your bosses, and you are afraid of each other, and you are even afraid of killing me." They would lose contact with the Underground Railroad. But I am not afraid of anything. I would be glad to be judged by God right this minute. There were such people in 1937 too, people who did not return to their cell for their bundles of belongings, who chose death, who signed nothing, denouncing anyone. It is this attitude, it is this resolve that conquers everything. even if you die in the course of standing up for the truth, it's worth it. At least you have self-respect. Because if you crumble, if this old woman had given away where this metropolitan had gone, she would have been diminished. Her soul would have been compromised. In the face of people that try to get you to submit, because make no mistake, this cancel culture is about submission. They want you to say things like, gender is fluid, not because they believe it's true. I mean, maybe some do, but because they want you to believe it, because they want you to do what they want you to do. It's about submission. They want to have power over you. They're bullies, like I said. And the only way, the best way to combat this attitude, this, petty tyranny of stupidity, is to stand up to it boldly and say, you know what? No, there is nothing you can do to me. I will not compromise myself. I will not compromise my friends. I will not do any of this. Sorry, shove it. Now, this next passage actually comes from one of Solzhenitsyn's very long footnotes. And he's talking about how, the Soviets did all these mass arrests. And he's talking about how this all could have been stopped if people had only stood up to it. And Solzhenitsyn in this footnote, he expresses how if only we had just, anytime we heard our neighbors screaming, if only we had gone out into the night with pitchforks and stopped this nonsense, if only we had showed force, then the Soviets would have had to back off. And so I'll read this and I'll, discuss, as I do, what I think it means for the current cancel culture. And how we burned in the camps later thinking, what would things have been like if every security operative, when he went out at night to make an arrest, had been uncertain whether he would return alive and had to say goodbye to his family? Or if, during periods of mass arrests, as for example in Leningrad, when they arrested a quarter of the entire city, people had not simply sat there in their layers, paling with terror at every bang of the downstairs door and at every step on the staircase, but had understood they had nothing left to lose, and had boldly set up in the downstairs hall an ambush of half a dozen people with axes, hammers, pokers, or whatever else was at hand. After all, you knew ahead of time that those blue caps were out there at night for no good purpose, and you could be sure ahead of time that you'd be cracking the skull of a cutthroat. Or what about the Black Maria sitting out there on the street with one lonely chauffeur? The organs would very quickly have suffered a shortage of officers in transport, and, notwithstanding all of Stalin's thirst, the cursed machine would have ground to a halt. If we didn't love freedom enough, and even more, we had no awareness of the real situation. We spent ourselves in one unrestrained outburst in 1917, and then we hurried to submit. We submitted with pleasure. People have got to start standing up. Solzhenitsyn's big point is that if there had been a united front presented among the people against these mass arrests that were done at night, if people had rallied, the Soviets would have been forced to back off. There's that old saying, when the government fears the people, there is liberty. When the people fear the government, there is tyranny. And that's true. If Stalin had feared his own people, he would have been in check. He would have been kept in check. But of course, his own people feared him and willfully submitted to all of his, insanities, even though they knew that they needed to not submit. And so it takes a certain level of courage. I've never seen anybody arrested at night unjustly before. I've never just seen people dragged from their homes in the way that they were dragged from their homes in the Soviet Union. I've not seen this type of mass arrest in my life, but if I do, if this cancel culture, this virtual totalitarianism that we see on social media and just in the media at large, if it branches over into the real physical world, concerning people's actual lives, I sure as hell hope I stand up and get other people to stand up with me against this stuff. But of course, the way to prevent that from ever happening is if we all stand up now against this stuff. If we all say, no, sorry, you can't just cancel people, you can't just fire people. whom you don't like, or whom you remotely disagree with. Sorry, you can't do this. If we all present a united front now, then later we will not be having to think, oh, what if we had done this? Because we would have done it. We would have prevented the disaster. Now, this next passage is really short. This is something that Solzhenitsyn heard in prison from a man named Festenko, who was one of his friends. And this guy, Festenko, says something that it really resonated with me. He said, "To stand up for the truth is nothing. For truth, you have to sit in jail." Now, what Festenko said there really, grips me, because it doesn't take much to say, to stand up and say something like, hey, I think racism is bad. Everyone's going to be standing up with you when you do that. That's you're standing up for the truth, but so is everyone else in that instance. It takes nothing to really stand up in that circumstance. But to stand up against the government, as say Festenko and these other people did, that's a whole other deal. For that, you have to sit in jail. What I take from this little passage is that for the truths that are controversial, for the truths that really matter in life, you have to be willing to accept the fact that you might be maligned by society. You might have to sit in jail. You might be canceled. You have to accept, in order to cancel culture, you have to accept that you might be canceled. And you have to accept that, hey, that's just the way that it is. And if everybody accepts that, and everybody starts standing up for the truth, and for their friends, for whom they disagree with, but whom they believe are good people, if everybody does this sort of thing, then all the bullies, again, will have to run away. Now, this next passage is, it's a bit extreme, I guess, to bring up in this context, but this next passage has to do with remembering those who did stand up and who died. Now, this is obviously Solzhenitsyn talking about the evil that the Soviet Union committed against its people, and he's talking about how people need to remember all those people that were forgotten in the Soviet gulags. And he's talking about how that's very important, but it's also very important in our cultural context today to remember those people who were canceled and maligned unfairly by society or by the government. You have to, in order to understand the stakes of things, you have to consider those who are fallen, even if they've fallen only in the virtual world. Thus, many were shot, thousands at first, then hundreds of thousands. We divide, we multiply, we sigh, we curse. But still, and all, these are just numbers. They overwhelm the mind and then are easily forgotten. And if someday the relatives of those who had been shot were to send one publisher photographs of their executed kin, and an album of those photographs were to be published in several volumes, then just by leafing through them and looking into the extinguished eyes, we would learn much that would be valuable for the rest of our lives. Such reading, almost without words, would leave a deep mark on our hearts for all eternity. In one household I am familiar with, where some former Czechs live, the following ceremony takes place. On March 5th, the day of the death of the head murderer, Stalin, they spread out on the table all the photographs of those who were shot and those who died in camps that they have been able to collect, several dozen of them. And throughout the day, solemnity reigns in the apartment, somewhat like that of a church, somewhat like that of a museum. There is funeral music, friends come to visit, to look at the photographs, to keep silent, to listen, to talk softly together. And then they leave without saying goodbye. And that is how it ought to be everywhere. At least these deaths would have left a small scar on our hearts, so that they should not have died in vain. Again, the supreme measure, the death penalty, this is way down the road of this cancel culture stuff, but make no mistake, this kind of cancel culture stuff can end up there. It has in the past. It ended up there in the Soviet Union. And so you need to remember, in these early days, and hopefully we're in the waning days of this cancel culture, but perhaps they're the early days of it. We need to remember, the people who were first banned, the people who we didn't like, who we actually thought, ought not to speak so much. We need to remember that it was not right for them to be, exorcised from polite society in the way that they were exorcised from polite society. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the last passage of this how to cancel culture section is this. This actually occurs towards the very end of the book. And this is Solzhenitsyn talking about a generation of Russians who seemed to understand what was at stake long before most of Russia understood what was at stake. It's a very compelling thing that Solzhenitsyn recounts here. That and it's an attitude that we should all have against, again, this this very bizarre virtual totalitarianism that could possibly one day end up in the real world, which would be a terrifying day indeed. And this quotation begins with a quotation of a man named Pasternak, who was a writer whom these young people that Solzhenitsyn was imprisoned with were quoting. This passage, this initial quotation comes from that, and it really had quite the effect on old Alexander. Not to arise with my whole land would have been harder still, and for the path that I have trod, I have no qualms at all. The young people imprisoned in these cells under the political articles of the Code were never the average young people of the nation, but were always separated from them by a wide gap. In those years, most of our young people still faced a future of disintegrating or becoming disillusioned, indifferent, falling in love with an easy life, and then, perhaps, beginning all over again the bitter climb from that cozy little valley up to a new peak. Possibly after another 20 years? But the young prisoners of 1945, sentenced under Article 5810, had leaped that whole future chasm of indifference in one jump and bore their heads boldly erect under the axe. What so greatly impacted Solzhenitsyn concerning these younger prisoners that he was with was that they understood what it would take decades for others to understand, which was that you need to stand for the truth now, at all costs. They thrust their heads boldly erect under the axe. They didn't care that they were imprisoned. In fact, they were proud of it. And so whenever it comes to this cancel culture stuff, if you're maligned in society, if you, people act like you're the bad guy when you're really the good guy, just stand firm. Don't apologize for anything unless you've actually done something wrong. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the final section of this review and analysis of the Gulag Archipelago Volume 1. And this section is called Wisdom Gained Through Suffering. Own nothing, possess nothing. Buddha and Christ taught us this, and the Stoics and the Cynics. Greedy though we are, why can't we seem to grasp that simple teaching? Can't we understand that with property we destroy our soul? So let the herring keep warm in your pocket until you get to the transit prison rather than beg for something to drink here. And did they give us a 2-day supply of bread and sugar? In that case, eat it in one sitting. Then no one will steal it from you, and you won't have to worry about it, and you'll be free as a bird in heaven. Own only what you can always carry with you. No languages, no countries, no people. Let your memory be your travel bag. Use your memory. Use your memory. It is those bitter seeds alone which might sprout and grow someday. When persecution comes your way, if it does, of course, if you stand up for unpopular truths, then it absolutely will come your way. Only hold on to what's up in here, because what's up in here and in here, that the bastards can't take from you. Now, this next passage comes towards the end of this first volume, and this is whenever Solzhenitsyn was actually being moved to nicer prisons, because, it's a very strange thing. Solzhenitsyn, he credits the only reason that he survived the gulags is because he lied about being a nuclear physicist. And so instead of them, putting him in a regular camp, eventually, whenever they, dug up that fake record, they were like, oh, a nuclear physicist. And so they sent him to an island where it wasn't as bad, where you're forced to work and everything, but it's not as medieval as some of the other camps. And this passage comes whenever Solzhenitsyn was being transferred by different guards across the country, where he had to remain silent in open public, on trains with regular people. It's just a very interesting passage because, yeah, he's just like, he's in amongst all these normal people, can't say a word about where he's going, about what he's doing, but he has this moment to reflect, like, oh my gosh, Look at how much people have. Look at how much people take for granted. So I'm just going to read the passage and we'll discuss further. Do not pursue what is illusory, property and position, all that is gained at the expense of your nerves decade after decade and is confiscated in one fell night. Live with a steady superiority over life. Don't be afraid of misfortune, and do not yearn after happiness. It is, after all the same. The bitter doesn't last forever, and the sweet never fills the cup to overflowing. It is enough if you don't freeze in the cold, and if thirst and hunger don't claw at your insides. If your back isn't broken, if your feet can walk, if both arms can bend, if both eyes see, and if both ears hear, then whom should you envy, and why? Our envy of others devours us most of all. Rub your eyes and purify your heart, and prize above all else in the world those who love you and who wish you well. Do not hurt them or scold them, and never part from any of them in your anger. After all, you simply do not know. It might be your last act before your arrest, and that will be how you are imprinted in their memory. That passage is just beautiful on its face, but there at the end it said, it might be your last act before your arrest. You might as well insert, it might be your last act before your death. And, if you're a jerk, if you take your life for granted, if you take the freedom you have for granted, then that is how you will be imprinted on the minds of many. Don't chase things that distract you from what life is all about. Now, this next sentence, I don't know, I just thought it was a very wise sentence. This is something to keep in mind, though, regarding violence and violence done against you. I'm just going to read it. A person who is not inwardly prepared for the use of violence against him is always weaker than the person committing the violence. You've got to be mentally prepared for persecution of the, verbal and spiritual type, but also the physical type. Because if you're not prepared for someone to do heinous, evil things to you, if you're not mentally prepared for that, then, those things will compromise you. You will submit when you ought not to. Moving on to the next passage. There is a simple truth which one can learn only through suffering. In war, not victories are blessed, but defeats. Governments need victories, and the people need defeats. Victory gives rise to the desire for more victories. But after a defeat, it is freedom that men desire, and usually attain. A people needs defeat just as an individual needs suffering and misfortune. They compel the deepening of the inner life and generate a spiritual upsurge. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the final passage in the wisdom gained through suffering section of this video, and it is the last passage we will go over in this video. And it reads, if only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? During the life of any heart, this line keeps changing place. Sometimes it is squeezed one way by exuberant evil, and sometimes it shifts to allow enough space for good to flourish. One and the same human being is, at various stages, under various circumstances, a totally different human being. At times he is close to being a devil, at times to sainthood. But his name doesn't change, and to that name we ascribe the whole lot, good and evil. Socrates taught us, know thyself. I feel like that is a good passage to end on, because it is 100% true. We are capable of sainthood and of absolute devilry. We could, you and me, who have never, never been a guard at any camp anywhere, we could end up being that way. We could shift the line inside our hearts to allow that sort of evil to happen. And we could also shift the line in our hearts to say no to that kind of evil. The point is that people often think of, the Nazis as, there are these other species of human. They just came out of the womb rotten. Not the case. I haven't read this book, but there's a book called Ordinary Men by Daniel Browning, where he talks about how the Nazi prison guards were actually ordinary men who loved ordinary things. But through a slow process of, indoctrination and, just mind games that they played on themselves, they were able to get themselves to do some of the most heinous acts against humanity ever in the history of humanity. We're all capable of good and evil. And we must know thyself. We must know this about us. Because if we refuse to acknowledge that we are capable of great good and great evil, if we refuse to acknowledge that, we are bound to find ourselves in a place we don't want to be, doing things we would have never thought us capable of doing. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, so that concludes my thoughts on the book. But if you have read the Gulag Archipelago, either Volume 1 or the abridged version, please leave any comments or questions you may have in the comment section below and let me know what you thought of the book. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, if you liked this video, please like it and subscribe, tell your friends about the channel. And never forget to